Imagine writing a screenplay so meticulously detailed, it practically breathes. A 35-page document outlining the ultimate cinematic murder, the lure, the plastic-lined kill room, the disposal. Now imagine the director refusing to call cut. He steps out from behind the camera and turns his horror script into a real-time diary. In the fall of 2008, a rented garage became a slaughterhouse designed for the silver screen. The blood on the concrete wasn't stage makeup, and the victim wasn't an actor who could go home when filming wrapped. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot, thank you. Mark Twitchell wanted to be a star. Living in Edmonton, Alberta, he presented himself as a visionary independent filmmaker on the verge of his big break. At 29, he had the outward trappings of a grounded adult life, a wife, a young daughter, a suburban home. But the reality behind the front door was hollow. Twitchell was bleeding money, funding his cinematic ambitions on maxed-out credit cards and borrowed time. He had recently directed a fan film set in a famous sci-fi universe, which garnered a small amount of local attention. But it wasn't enough. He craved visceral impact. He wanted to be recognized as a master of psychological terror. His obsession wasn't just with the camera. Twitchell was completely fixated on the hit television series Dexter, a show centered around a blood spatter analyst who moonlighted as a vigilante serial killer. He didn't just watch the episodes, he studied them. He analyzed the kill rooms, the plastic sheeting, the extreme emotional detachment of the protagonist. He began to mold his own identity around this fictional anti-hero. Twitchell even cast himself in a short thriller titled House of Cards, a script he wrote about a masked killer luring a cheating husband to a remote garage. The lines between his daily reality as a struggling father and the dark fantasies living inside his laptop were beginning to blur, merging into a dangerous compulsion for absolute control. Across town, a completely different kind of life was unfolding. John Brian Altinger, known to his friends as Johnny, was a 38-year-old man who appreciated simplicity. He was employed in the heavy manufacturing sector, specifically working with oil field equipment. It was demanding, blue-collar work. Johnny spent his days maneuvering steel machinery weighing thousands of pounds, earning a solid living through sweat and routine. He was reliable, deeply loyal to his circle, and passionately interested in motorcycles. He loved taking long rides on his bike, pushing 100 miles outside the city limits to clear his head after a grueling work week. Johnny was also single. The isolation of his demanding schedule had started to weigh heavily on him. He wanted a genuine connection. Like thousands of other working professionals navigating the modern dating landscape, he turned to the internet. He set up a profile on a popular dating website, hoping to find someone who shared his straightforward values. He wasn't looking for games or fleeting encounters. He wanted a partner to share his life with. These two men inhabited completely separate spheres within the sprawling Canadian landscape. One was grounded in the heavy physical reality of industrial labor, looking for honest companionship. The other was lost in a self-made labyrinth of cinematic violence and unearned grandiosity, desperate to bridge the gap between imagination and execution. Twitchell needed a set for his upcoming film projects. In September 2008, he signed a lease for a detached double-car garage in a quiet residential alleyway in the city's south side. It was a utilitarian space, bare walls, a concrete floor, completely isolated from the main street. He told the property owner he needed it to store equipment and shoot a few interior scenes. He immediately went to work transforming the space. He purchased heavy-duty plastic sheeting, industrial-strength tape, and a heavy metal table. He meticulously draped the walls in plastic, mirroring the exact aesthetic of his favorite television show. To his film crew, this was just set dressing, a dedicated director going the extra mile for authenticity. But Twitchell was no longer just preparing to film a movie. He was preparing a stage. Johnny Altinger spent his evenings scrolling through dating profiles in his modest condo. He sent polite messages, saving his money, maintaining a quiet and structured existence. He had absolutely no reason to suspect that his desire for a normal relationship was about to intersect with a man trying to write himself into a nightmare. The transition from a suburban father to a predator required infrastructure. The rented garage on 56th Street provided the physical space, But the digital space required an entirely different kind of architecture. Sitting in front of his laptop, the aspiring director began crafting his most important script yet, The Lure. He navigated to the dating platform Plenty of Fish and constructed a phantom. He created a profile for a woman named Sheena. Sheena was designed to be irresistible to a lonely man, attractive, adventurous, and slightly aggressive in her pursuit. The digital trap was set. Now, he needed to finalize the stage. Inside the detached garage, the temperature often hovered around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, trapping the heavy scent of damp concrete and industrial adhesive. The windows were completely blacked out. Thick layers of polyurethane plastic sheeting covered the walls, secured with endless strips of silver duct tape. A heavy metal table sat in the center of the floor, alongside a game processing kit containing various knives, a meat cleaver, and a handsaw. In his mind, the men he intended to lure were not breathing individuals with families and futures. They were simply blank slates, faceless white mannequins meant to be posed, used, and discarded for the sake of his ultimate production. He was no longer just an observer of fictional violence. He was the author. By the first week of October, the phantom named Sheena had successfully hooked a target. But it was not Johnny Altinger. The first man to walk into the trap was a 26-year-old named Gilles Tétriot. He had matched with Sheena online and exchanged a series of flirtatious messages. The instructions she provided for their first date were highly specific and undeniably strange. She directed him to avoid the front door of the house, instructing him instead to walk down a dark residential alley and enter through the side door of a detached garage. She claimed she was renting the space and wanted to surprise him. On the evening of October 3rd, Tétriot drove to the designated neighborhood. He parked his car a few blocks away and walked into the pitch-black alleyway. The air was biting, and the absolute silence of the suburban backstreet made his stomach twist. Every survival instinct screamed at him to turn around and walk back to his vehicle. But the social pressure of a first date, the fear of looking foolish or standing up a woman who had simply arranged a quirky meeting, pushed him forward. He reached the side door of the garage. It was unlocked. Tétriot pushed the heavy door open and stepped into absolute darkness. He called out, asking if anyone was there. A muffled voice from the pitch-black corner instructed him to step further inside. He took 2 more steps. Without warning, a figure lunged from the shadows. The attacker was clad in a black hockey mask, his eyes entirely hidden. A high-voltage stun baton cracked through the dark, a blinding arc of blue electricity, and struck Tétriot directly in the chest. The jolt paralyzed his muscles for a fraction of a second, sending him crashing onto the cold concrete floor. The attacker immediately dropped his weight onto the downed man, pressing a gloved hand over his mouth and pinning his limbs. This was the moment the script dictated that the victim would lose consciousness, allowing the director to begin his dark work. But reality refused to follow the screenplay. Tétriot was terrified, but the adrenaline flooding his system triggered an explosive fight-or-flight response. He realized instantly that this was not a mugging. This was a fight for his life. He thrashed wildly, bucking his hips and throwing violent, uncoordinated punches. The metal baton clattered across the concrete as the 2 men rolled over the plastic-lined floor. Tétriot managed to break the hold, scrambling on his hands and knees toward the large rolling garage door. He desperately grabbed the bottom handle and hoisted it upward, creating a gap of about 2 feet. He dove under the rising metal door, scraping his back against the track, gasping the freezing night air. But before he could get to his feet, 2 heavy hands wrapped around his ankles. The attacker dragged him backward, pulling him back into the plastic-lined nightmare. Tétriot kicked backwards with everything he had, his heavy boots connecting with flesh and bone. He broke free a second time, scrambled to his feet on the alley pavement, and braced for another attack. The masked figure emerged from beneath the garage door. But instead of continuing the assault, the attacker froze. The violent predator suddenly broke character. The man in the hockey mask held up his hands, his posture completely shifting, and explained that it was all just a joke, a misunderstanding meant for a movie. Tétriot didn't wait to hear the rest of the explanation. He turned and sprinted down the alley, his lungs burning until he reached the safety of his locked car. Ashamed, confused, and second-guessing what he had just survived, he chose not to contact the authorities that night. He convinced himself it really was a bizarre prank gone wrong. Back in the alley, the director closed the garage door. The first take had been a catastrophic failure. The stun baton was practically useless against a struggling 200-pound man. The physical realities of subduing a human being were far messier than they appeared on television. He didn't panic. He simply retreated to his laptop, opened his digital journal, and began writing notes on how to improve the trap. He noted that the baton was insufficient. He realized he needed a heavier, blunt instrument for the initial strike. He refined the script, adjusted the lighting, and reset the stage. The trap was empty, but it wouldn't stay that way for long. Exactly 1 week later, the phantom profile activated again. On October 10th, the digital trap was baited and cast back into the dating pool. It did not take long for the algorithm to connect the fake persona with a man actively seeking a genuine relationship. Johnny received the exact same set of instructions that had been sent out 7 days prior. The messages from the woman were highly specific. Skip the front door of the house, park on the adjacent street, walk down the unlit alleyway, and enter the rented garage through the side access. The setup was undeniably odd. Johnny was a practical, grounded man who dealt in the heavy reality of steel and oilfield mechanics, and this covert meeting sounded more like an adolescent prank than a Friday night date. Still, the prospect of a connection pushed his skepticism aside. Before leaving his condo, he made a single, pragmatic decision. He opened his email, drafted a quick message to a close friend, and pasted the exact driving directions the woman had provided. He noted that he was heading to this specific address for a date, essentially leaving a digital breadcrumb trail just in case the situation turned out to be a scam. That mundane action, the simple click of the send button, was the only reason he did not disappear without a trace. The temperature outside had dropped into the upper 30s as the sun set over the suburbs. Johnny climbed into his red Mazda and drove toward the south side of the city. He navigated the quiet residential grid, eventually pulling over on 56th Street just as the instructions demanded. He turned off the engine. He stepped out into the crisp autumn air, zipping up his jacket against the biting chill. He walked toward the alley. There were no street lamps illuminating the narrow corridor between the fences and the detached garages. The crunch of gravel under his heavy boots was the only sound. He found the specific side door. He reached out and turned the handle. It was unlocked. Johnny pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air in the garage was stagnant, heavy with the sharp chemical odor of polyurethane plastic and industrial adhesive. It was completely dark. He called out, asking if anyone was there. From the pitch-black corner, a voice told him to step further in. He took another step. The director lunged. There was no high-voltage stun baton this time. The script had been revised. The weapon of choice was a heavy steel pipe. The attacker swung the metal bar with maximum force. It connected solidly. The sickening crack of steel against bone echoed in the confined space. The impact dropped the heavy-set mechanic instantly. Johnny crashed onto the concrete floor, completely disoriented, his vision exploding into white flashes. But the blue-collar worker was incredibly strong. The initial shock wore off in a fraction of a second, replaced by pure, adrenaline-fueled survival instinct. He fought back. The struggle was violent, messy, and entirely devoid of cinematic grace. They rolled across the floor. Heavy boots kicked against the walls, tearing the plastic sheeting. The metal preparation table screeched across the concrete. Johnny threw desperate punches, trying to push the masked weight off his chest, gasping for air in the freezing, dark room. He scrambled, trying to find leverage, trying to reach the door. The attacker realized he was losing physical control. He dropped the steel pipe. He pulled a heavy hunting knife. The fight ended in a frantic, brutal sequence. The knife pierced flesh again and again. The frantic thrashing slowed. The heavy breathing turned into a wet, ragged gasp, and then absolute silence. The director stood up in the dark. He was panting, his muscles burning from the exertion. He looked down at the floor. The victim was dead. There was no panic. There was no overwhelming wave of remorse or shock. Instead, the man in the mask felt a profound, chilling sense of validation. He had successfully transitioned the violence from his imagination into the physical world. He walked over to his laptop, which was sitting on a workbench, booted it up, and immediately began typing a detailed account of what he had just experienced. He documented the feeling of the struggle, the resistance of the victim, and the ultimate thrill of taking a life. He treated the murder like a successful dress rehearsal. Then, the labor began. The reality of dealing with a deceased human being weighing nearly 200 pounds is a logistical nightmare. It requires hours of exhausting, methodical work. The killer pulled the game processing kit onto the metal table. He stripped off his outer layers and began the gruesome process of dismemberment. It was not clean, it was not fast. The hand saw required immense physical effort to cut through heavy bone and joint. The smell of copper filled the enclosed space, thick and suffocating. The sheer volume of fluids overwhelmed the hastily constructed kill room. Despite the meticulous layers of duct tape and plastic sheeting draped across the walls and floor, the barrier was not perfect. Deep crimson fluid pooled at the edges of the room, found microscopic gaps in the adhesive tape, and seeped directly into the porous concrete underneath. The killer worked relentlessly through the night. He separated the remains, packing them tightly into heavy-duty industrial trash bags. He wiped down the metal table, sprayed chemical cleaners over the plastic walls, and attempted to scrub the worst of the mess from the floor. He gathered the victim's personal effects, his wallet, his keys, his phone. He wasn't just disposing of a body, he was planning to steal an identity. In the early hours of the morning, long before the suburban neighborhood woke up, the killer secured the heavy black bags. He locked the side door of the garage, leaving the faint smell of bleach and copper trapped inside. He walked out to the street, located the red Mazda parked right where the victim had left it, and used the stolen keys to unlock the door. He slid into the driver's seat. He started the engine and drove the victim's car away from the scene, blending seamlessly into the morning traffic. The physical body had been erased from the map. Now, the director needed to erase the man's digital footprint, setting the stage for the final act of his horrific production. The weekend passed with an unsettling quiet. By Monday morning, the heavy machinery operator did not show up for his scheduled shift at the manufacturing plant. This was a glaring anomaly. He was the kind of employee who arrived early, methodically checked his equipment, and never missed a day without a formal phone call. When his supervisor checked the company inbox, there was a message waiting, but it wasn't a standard sick leave notification. The email claimed that the sender had met an extraordinary woman over the weekend. It stated that he was resigning from his position immediately, packing his bags, and boarding a plane to Costa Rica for an extended romantic getaway. Similar messages landed in the inboxes of his closest friends. The digital ventriloquism was clumsy. The killer was attempting to write a script for a dead man, but he failed to understand the character he was playing. The people reading these messages stared at their screens in absolute disbelief. The vocabulary was entirely wrong. The emails were filled with flowery adjectives, melodramatic phrasing, and breathless enthusiasm. It sounded like poorly written movie dialogue, not the pragmatic, straightforward communication of a blue-collar worker. Furthermore, the narrative itself was utterly implausible. The man they knew was fiercely dedicated to his routines. He loved his motorcycle, his friends, and the financial stability his grueling job provided. He was not the type of person to abandon his entire life on a whim for a stranger he met on the internet. He was cautious. He was planning for the future. The psychological horror of realizing that a stranger's fingers were typing on his keyboard, pretending to be him, sent a shockwave of dread through his inner circle. The anxiety rapidly metastasized into genuine panic. They tried calling his cell phone repeatedly, but the calls went straight to a generic voicemail. Text messages remained unread. By Tuesday, a small group of his friends decided they could no longer wait for a response. They drove to his condominium complex, their stomachs nodding with every passing mile as the cold October wind rattled the bare trees. The building superintendent, sensing their mounting distress, agreed to let them inside the unit. The apartment was completely silent. The air was stale, carrying the faint scent of old coffee and undisturbed dust. Everything was exactly as it should be for a man who had simply stepped out for the evening. Dishes sat in the drying rack. His heavy winter boots were missing, but his everyday sneakers were lined up by the door. His mail was stacked neatly on the kitchen counter. They moved into the bedroom and began searching through his personal files. Within minutes, they found the absolute confirmation that their friend had not boarded a flight to Central America. Sitting inside a secure drawer, untouched and left behind, was his passport. You cannot fly to Costa Rica without a passport. The tropical romance was a poorly fabricated lie. The friends immediately drove to the local police precinct to file a missing persons report. Initially, they met the standard bureaucratic friction. Law enforcement agencies deal with runaway adults every single day, and the initial assumption is almost always that the individual chose to disappear to clear their head. The patrol officers noted that the missing man was in his late 30s, legally autonomous, and completely capable of leaving the country if he wished. But the friends refused to be dismissed. They laid out the glaring inconsistencies, the completely out-of-character emails, the abandoned travel documents, the sudden, unceremonious resignation from a lucrative career. Then, they produced a smoking gun. They handed the desk sergeant a printed copy of the email the victim had sent just hours before he vanished. It contained the highly specific driving directions to a residential alleyway on 56th Street. The police realized they were no longer dealing with a voluntary disappearance. The atmosphere in the precinct shifted instantly from routine paperwork to active, high-alert urgency. As patrol units were briefed, a heavy, unspoken fear began to ripple through the city's manufacturing community. Rumors spread rapidly across the shop floors and break rooms. A dependable, well-liked mechanic had vanished without a trace after logging onto a dating site. The social echo was chilling. Single men in the area who used the same online platforms suddenly found themselves scrutinizing their matches, wondering if the women they were messaging were actually predators operating behind fake avatars. The digital landscape, usually a space for connection and vulnerability, suddenly felt like an active hunting ground. Trust evaporated. Detectives immediately focused their resources on the digital breadcrumb trail. They ran the IP addresses associated with the bizarre getaway emails. They contacted the dating platform to pull the internal records for the phantom profile that had lured the victim into the dark. And most importantly, they targeted the physical address provided in that final life-saving message. The driving directions did not lead to a sprawling suburban house or an apartment building. They led down a dark, narrow corridor of cracked pavement lined with utility poles and refuse bins. They led directly to a detached, double-car garage. Investigators dispatched an unmarked unit to the South Side neighborhood. They needed to secure the perimeter, run the license plates of any vehicles in the vicinity, and figure out exactly who was renting the structure. The case was about to pivot violently from a standard missing person inquiry into a full-scale forensic excavation. The fabricated script was unraveling at the seams, and the director was about to be pulled out from behind the camera. The transition from a missing persons inquiry to a homicide investigation hinged entirely on the physical coordinates provided in that final life-saving email. Detectives descended on the quiet residential alleyway and located the specific structure. After securing a search warrant and cutting a heavy steel padlock, investigators raised the rolling metal door. The interior was completely silent and entirely devoid of vehicles, but the atmosphere was immediately oppressive. The air was thick with the suffocating fumes of industrial bleach and heavy-duty degreasers, a chemical assault attempting to mask a faint, underlying metallic odor. The walls were still partially draped in thick plastic sheeting. To the naked eye, the concrete floor looked clean, save for a few dark stains near the center drain, but human blood is notoriously resilient. When crime scene technicians darkened the garage and applied specialized chemical reagents, the floor illuminated in a brilliant, terrifying blue luminescence. The reaction revealed broad, sweeping drag marks, massive pooling areas, and high-velocity spatter patterns cast against the plastic-lined walls. A catastrophic amount of bloodletting had occurred in this tight space, far more than could be explained away by a simple accident. The property owner quickly provided the name on the lease agreement. The space was rented to an aspiring local filmmaker. Investigators located the suspect and brought him into the precinct for an initial interview. This is typically the moment a guilty individual shows stress fractures, sweating, defensive posturing, a demand for legal counsel, but the director did not break a sweat. He sat in the interrogation room with an air of mild amusement, completely relaxed, practically eager to answer questions. He listened to the detectives outline the horrific findings in his rented garage. Without missing a beat, he launched into a meticulously rehearsed narrative. He explained that he was an independent director currently shooting a dark psychological thriller. The plot of his short film involved a masked killer luring a man into a plastic-lined garage. The horrific scene the police had discovered, he insisted, was simply his movie set. He claimed the blood on the floor was an expensive theatrical prop, a specialized synthetic mixture purchased online to look incredibly realistic on camera. He even offered to show them the prop weapons used during the shoot. It was a brilliantly constructed red herring. The defense was entirely logical within the context of his known profession. The detectives found themselves staring at a massive hurdle. They had a garage full of fluid that might just be stage blood, a suspect with a documented history of directing violent indie films, and absolutely no physical body to prove a crime had actually taken place. The investigation stalled, trapped in a frustrating limbo between fiction and reality. The suspect walked out of the police station, having successfully played the role of an eccentric, misunderstood artist. But a script relies on continuity, and the director had left a massive plot hole sitting in plain sight. While the forensic teams awaited lab results on the fluid samples, a patrol unit canvassed the neighborhoods surrounding the suspect's residence. They found a red Mazda parked conspicuously in the driveway of an acquaintance. When questioned, the homeowner explained that the filmmaker had asked to store the car there, claiming he had purchased it for a friend. A quick check of the vehicle identification number shattered the movie set alibi. The car belonged to the missing oilfield worker. Detectives immediately executed a high-risk search warrant at the suspect's suburban home. They bypassed the standard physical evidence and went straight for the nerve center of his operation, his electronics. A heavy encrypted laptop was seized from his home office and handed directly to the Cyber Crimes Division. The suspect had been confident. He had formatted his hard drive and deleted his digital journal, assuming that moving files to the digital trash bin permanently erased them from existence. But digital forensics is an exact science. Data is rarely destroyed. It is simply unindexed, waiting in the dark sectors of a hard drive for someone to dig it out. After hours of meticulous reconstruction, a cyber analyst recovered a 35-page Microsoft Word document. It was titled simply, SK Confessions. The detectives crowded around the monitor, reading the recovered text in absolute silence. It was not a screenplay. It was not a treatment for an upcoming thriller. It was a step-by-step first-person diary of a descent into madness. The prose was a masterclass in extreme narcissism. The author chronicled his lifelong fascination with violence and his conscious decision to transition from a suburban father to an apex predator. He wrote extensively about his admiration for fictional serial killers, analyzing their methods and noting how he planned to improve upon them in the real world. The document detailed the construction of the kill room on 56th Street. It documented the creation of the phantom dating profile. Then, it provided an excruciatingly detailed account of the first failed attempt. The author complained about the physical resilience of the first victim, expressing frustration that the stun baton failed to incapacitate a 200-pound man. He wrote about the target crawling under the garage door and escaping into the alley, forcing him to rethink his choice of weaponry. The narrative then shifted to October 10th. The pacing of the writing accelerated. The author described the arrival of the second man, the heavy machinery operator who walked into the trap. The document detailed the ambush with a heavy steel pipe, the desperate, violent struggle on the concrete floor, and the final, fatal strikes with a hunting knife. The author noted the exact sound of the victim's final exhalation. The horrific diary did not stop at the murder. It laid out the exhausting logistics of the aftermath. The text described the grueling physical labor of dismemberment using a handsaw, noting the overwhelming smell and the sheer volume of effort required to reduce a human being into manageable pieces. Finally, the author detailed loading the heavy black bags into his vehicle, driving to a specific suburban alleyway, and dropping the remains deep into the city's underground storm sewer system. The recovered file was the ultimate undoing of the scripted killer. He had successfully erased the physical evidence, manipulated his friends, and lied his way through a police interrogation. But his ego demanded an audience. He could not resist documenting his masterpiece. In his desperate need to feel like a visionary, he had provided law enforcement with a complete signed confession detailing exactly how, where, and why he destroyed a human life. The missing persons case was officially closed. A homicide manhunt had begun. The trial commenced in the spring of 2011, transforming an Edmonton courtroom into the final act of a deeply disturbing production. The defense strategy relied on a desperate pivot. The filmmaker took the stand and admitted to the physical act of ending the victim's life, but he insisted the entire scenario was meant to be a harmless prank, an immersive entertainment experience that spiraled out of control. He claimed the heavy machinery operator became unreasonably aggressive during the encounter, forcing a lethal struggle in sheer self-defense. It was a fabricated narrative, entirely dismantled by his own ego. Prosecutors simply presented the recovered digital diary. The 35-page document systematically destroyed the self-defense argument. The text highlighted the meticulous premeditation, the advanced purchase of the game processing kit, and the previous failed ambush involving the high-voltage baton. The prosecution noted that no one prepares a heavy metal table and poly-wrapped walls for a practical joke. The document was an undeniable step-by-step blueprint for a calculated thrill kill. The jury required very little time to see through the cinematic facade. On April 12, 2011, they returned a swift and unanimous verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence carried a mandatory life term in a federal penitentiary, permanently stripping the director of his audience, his cameras, and his freedom for a minimum of 25 years. Mark Twitchell wanted to leave a legacy in the world of cinema. He succeeded, but not as a visionary director. He is remembered only as a man who allowed his vanity to completely eclipse his humanity. A predator who built a slaughterhouse just to play the lead role. The terror of this case lies in the cold, calculated choice to erase the boundary between a screenplay and a breathing man. He treated a brutal execution as an artistic exercise, and traded 2 lives for a story no one ever wanted to see. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.